Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Kevin McCain. Hey there, Kevin.
Hi.
Can you, before we get started, just say briefly where you teach, and then we'll jump into today's topic?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jordan. This is great. I just want to start off by saying that I've watched several of the YouTube videos and listened to some of the podcasts. So a lot of hard acts to follow. So hopefully this won't be too disappointing. I'm at University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So today's topic is going to be on evidence. And here's the big idea. I have posted several videos offering arguments for theism. And the comments on those videos tend to have a slogan in them. Not just one or two comments. There are many comments that have the following slogan: there is no evidence for God. And I'm thinking, I just made a video that gave a bunch of evidence, it seems, but somehow there's no evidence. So I wanted to bring someone on to answer this question. What is evidence? I think if we can get clear on that, then it will help settle it. I don't know if it will settle the question, but maybe we can make progress on this question of whether or not there is evidence for God. So that's why I'm having on Kevin today. All right, let's look at the question more particularly here, and then we can unpack this for the remainder of the interview. What is evidence? Is your definition, and I'm talking about your definition of evidence, whatever you answer there, is your definition widely accepted among philosophers, both atheists and theists? I ask because many online atheists say things like, there is no evidence for God, but surely that depends on what we mean by evidence. Also, what kind of things count as evidence? Do arguments count as evidence? I ask because if there is a strong argument for the existence of God and arguments count as evidence, then there is evidence for God. All right. You can begin wherever you'd like.
Okay. Yeah. I'll try to start at the beginning. And you may have to remind me of some of the questions. So what is evidence? I think I'll say some things that are uncontroversial at first and then get to more controversial. I'll start off with something that is maybe controversial to the people who post that response to you, but is uncontroversial to pretty much everyone else. And that's, I think the post displays an error in thinking. It's either the error is totally misunderstanding evidence, or it's applying different standards of evidence to the existence of God than we do to just about anything else, which is
okay.
Right.
Okay.
But so that's going to be a little bit controversial, but not really amongst philosophers. So the first question was, what is evidence? I think in broadest terms, evidence is simply something that indicates how things are. Okay, so we can think of this in a variety of ways, right? So smoke is evidence of fire, right? It indicates there's fire. Fingerprints on a murder weapon are an indication of guilt, right? Someone's guilt. But what's tricky is those sorts of things are physical objects, right? But other things are evidence too, right? So the fact that I'm having a visual experience of you right now is evidence that, I'm talking to you. That's an indication that things are such that we're having a conversation right now. So in one sense, in a very broad sense, evidence is, just an indication of how things are. Now it gets tricky because in, our everyday discussions, we use the term evidence for a variety of very different things. So I mentioned some very physical things first, like smoke, fingerprints on a weapon. So a lot of times we think of evidence as the sort of thing that in a court of law can literally be picked up, handed to someone, and checked into an evidence locker. That's a sense of evidence. But really, that can't be the sort of evidence someone means. Well, they can mean this, but it's a mistake, right? So if you're talking about whether it's reasonable to believe something, so I assume that the person making this sort of complaint about your videos saying there is no evidence for God is meaning something to the effect like it's irrational to believe in God because there's no evidence, right? So the evidence we're after there is the sort of evidence that makes belief rational or not. No one believes that a defendant is guilty because there's fingerprints on a knife. They might believe that someone is guilty because they're aware that there are fingerprints on the knife, or they know there are fingerprints on the knife, or those sorts of things. But the mere fact that there are fingerprints on the knife doesn't give anyone a reason to believe anything, right? You have to be, in some sense, you have to have that evidence in your cognitive life. So, I mean, think about it. If you have the murder weapon with someone's fingerprints on it, but it's at the bottom of the lake and no one knows that it's there, no one's ever found it, that's not evidence for anyone, right? So what we mean typically, what philosophers are thinking of when we talk about evidence in terms of what's rational and what's not is something different than the sort of physical sense of evidence, right? It's some sort of mental access we have to this indicator, right? And so that's pretty uncontroversial.
So there's typically people think of evidence as an indicator of the way things are. And that's right. But there's this additional, there's something that that might be a necessary condition, but maybe not a sufficient condition for evidence. It seems like to have evidence, you not only have to have the indication itself, but you also have to have awareness of of the thing that's indicating the way things are. I hope I said that correctly.
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. I mean, I think it's perfectly fine to use the term evidence, and I think it's correct, like in the court of law sense, to say, this, the fingerprints on this knife are evidence of the defendant's guilt. But that sort of evidence on its own doesn't give us reason to believe anything or not. We have to, in some sense, possess that evidence. And it's more than, say, holding the weapon in your hand. That's not possessing the evidence in the right way. And so what we typically talk about when we're talking about evidence, when philosophers are interested in this, we're talking about some sort. So I'm trying to be very careful to not say the controversial stuff yet, but something that we have somehow in our cognitive lives that we can form beliefs on the basis of. Maybe that's the least controversial way of saying it. I can't form a belief on the basis of fingerprints out in the world. I can form a belief on the basis of my knowledge that the fingerprints are there, or my awareness of the fingerprints being there, or even, to take something, this starts to get a little controversial, but take something like a sensory impression, that sort of evidence, right? So when I feel a pain, I can form a basis on that feeling, right? On the basis of that feeling, I believe I'm in pain.
You can form a belief on the basis of that feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of sense of evidence that we mean in philosophy. So we mean, the sort of thing that we can base our beliefs upon is kind of maybe the more.
Okay. Yes, this is helpful. Okay. Would it be, before moving on, one more clarification point? Could we use this terminology? Could we say, evidence is an indication of how things are, but that kind of like evidence meant in that sense doesn't give me any reason to believe. It doesn't give me any basis for my beliefs. What I have to have instead is the possession of evidence. I have to possess evidence. And by possess, I mean, like, again, it's not enough to just hold it in my hand. I have to have an awareness of that evidence. And once I have the awareness of that evidence, I'm calling that possession of evidence. Now that gives me something to base my beliefs on.
Right. I think that's a fair assessment, right? So that the only evidence that's going to make a belief of mine rational or not is the evidence that I have. Right. Now, granted, like I said, that's a bit controversial
Okay.
because philosophers will sometimes say, well, evidence that you don't have but you should have had can affect what's rational or not. I think they're wrong about that, but that's at least controversial. But for the most part, it's evidence that you have that determines what's rational or not.
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice pithy way of saying it. Okay. So the second question then was, how widely accepted is the way you just characterized evidence? How widely accepted is that view among philosophers, both atheists and theists?
I think in that conception of just, the kind of basic thing about evidence without getting into any details is pretty widely accepted. Now, philosophers will fight about um, whether you have to have evidence at all in order to be rational. So there are some who say, no, you don't need evidence at all, right? If your belief is just formed as the right sort of response to a stimulus or whatever, or formed in certain ways, what's very familiar, like if it's the result of a properly functioning cognitive faculty and the right sort of thing, then it's rational or justified, warranted, planting a sense, without any evidence, maybe. So philosophers will fight about that. But most will grant that this is what we mean by evidence. And even if they don't think evidence is necessary, they will think evidence can make a difference to what's rational or not.
Right. Yeah, you said that well. And I have many interviews people can go check out with Andrew Moon and also Chris Tucker
Mhm.
defending views where, well, at least with Andrew Moon defending views where you can have a properly basic belief. You can have a belief that's rational even apart from evidence. But that's not necessary for what you're saying. You're saying we all will agree on at least this kind of minimal characterization of what evidence is.
Right. And then, then we'll fight about things like, so Chris is going to say, evidence consists of seemings and appearances.
Yeah.
He's right about that, I think. But not everyone agrees with us on that. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the first two questions. Now we know what evidence is, and we know that that characterization of it is pretty widely accepted. And now let's get to the there is no evidence for God claim. So I guess maybe before we get there is no evidence for God, let's answer this. What kind of things count as evidence? What do you think about that?
Yeah, good. That's a great question. So we start to get into a little bit more of the controversy here. So there's a variety of things that people will allow. So we can set aside an issue of like the ontology of evidence, right? So there's this important question of, given what we've already said, does your evidence consist of the mental state? So take whatever it might be, my evidence or some of my evidence that we're having a conversation now. Some of that is, I see you and hear you and so on. Is that evidence the proposition that I see Jordan? So the proposition is my evidence and I have it by seeing you or so on. Or is the evidence simply my mental state, the mental state of having this visual experience? So that's something that people can fight about. I personally think the correct answer is the latter one, that the evidence is the mental state. It can be characterized propositionally, but it's not the actual proposition. So there's some disagreements there. But in one sense, we're still going to count roughly the same sorts of things as evidence. We're going to say that a visual experience, right? So our perceptions, those count as evidence. We're just going to disagree on, is it the experience itself that's the evidence, or is the experience the vehicle by which we get the evidence, these propositions? Like I said, I won't go into the details on it, and unless there's interest, but I think part of the reason why it's wrong to think it's a proposition is this leads people to, in some sense, make these mistaken claims about evidentialism, right? The idea that what's rational or justified is solely a matter of the evidence. I think people will object to evidentialism because they're assuming evidence has to be propositions. And then you get these weird cases of where, well, I'm in pain. I'm clearly justified. What proposition is justifying me that I'm in pain? Is it just that I'm in pain? That seems kind of circular. But anyway, setting that aside, we all agree that, say, your experiences are evidence, whether you have the mental state view or the propositional view. People will agree widely that testimony is evidence. Right. So you tell me something, you told me your name is Jordan. I am perfectly rational in believing that. I have great evidence for believing that, now the evidence consists of, you told me, it may also consist of background evidence, things I know, like, well, it's really unlikely for someone to just lie to you about what their name is without good reason, or so on. So you've got perception, you've got testimony. Memory provides a source of evidence, right? I remembered that we were going to have this discussion this morning, and that's why I got up and came into the office. But also, as you mentioned later in the question, arguments are fantastic evidence, right? One of the things, and some listeners may be familiar with, I mentioned evidentialism, and so it may bring to mind some arguments against evidentialism, right? So people are like, why talk about that? Didn't Plantinga take care of that 20 years ago and warranted Christian belief? Yes and no, right? So there's a view that is referred to as evidentialism, right? Where it's like evidentialism, where it's you how to have good evidence to rationally believe something. But the version of evidentialism that Plantinga takes on, for instance, has this really, really strict, strong conception of evidence, right? Like you have to have a knockdown argument before something's justified. And then he rightly just takes that to task. But I think that's a view of evidentialism that no evidentialist that I know of holds, right?
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't held, since at least in modern, contemporary times. I've known of no evidentialist that holds that. That said, all evidentialists and pretty much everyone else in philosophy agrees that a good argument is good evidence, right? So the evidentialist doesn't say you have to have a good argument to have evidence, but the evidentialist and everyone else agrees that a good argument is good evidence.
Let me
that's
ask you
why philosophers do that, give arguments,
Yeah. Okay. So this may get into some of the talk about propositions in just a second, but can you explain why do you think arguments are good evidence?
Oh, good. I mean, it's a good question. I think arguments are good evidence because, they're great indicators of the truth, right? Especially if you give me a valid argument, we know that if the first, however many claims and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, right? So that is really good evidence. And now I don't hold this view, but you might think that, because I don't think you have to have an argument all the time, right? So, I don't need an argument for thinking I'm talking to you now, right? I just have certain experiences and they justify me, in believing this. But you might think that a lot of what makes for rationality and so on comes in the form of argumentative structure, right? So having a good argument just in one sense maps out, when I teach arguments to students, premises can also be referred to as reasons, right? Reasons for your conclusion, right? It's just what we would think of in rationality. So if your belief is rational, a common sense thing, now this is somewhat controversial. So you mentioned Andrew might object to this when it comes to warrant. It's, I think he's more of an internalist on justification now. He doesn't like to advertise that, but
Yeah.
when it comes to warrant, he made this
really quick. We've used a couple of terms, so I'll pause you there.
Yeah.
And that's okay if we take a couple minutes. So I understand warrant to be whatever that thing is that turns mere true belief into a case of knowledge. Right. Okay, but you can be justified in believing something even if it isn't true, right? So you can be it seems like justification and warrant come apart.
Yes.
You can't, in order to be warranted, the belief has to be true.
Well, there's some disagreement about that. So some people,
okay.
Some people think, or at least I think there's a debate about this, whether warrant entails truth, or if you could have a warranted belief that isn't true, right? So it has all the other features of knowledge, but truth. So I'm not sure on that.
That's interesting. I just was unaware of that. I always was thinking, if warrant turns something into knowledge, it seems like I can't know false things. I can only know true things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But the issue, I think, in that debate hinges on whether your belief could have that property that, if it were true, would turn it into knowledge, even if it's not true. And some people argue that, no, it
Okay.
can't. You know, my own take is maybe warrant does entail truth, right? So if you got warrant, you got then how to say. So I have various views that are maybe not as popular. Then, so I don't find much use in the term warrant, because if it includes truth and everything else that turns something into knowledge, what has it told me? You know, I mean, why not just say knowledge? But so I'm neutral on the whether it entails truth or not.
Okay.
Yeah, so warrant is a stronger condition than justification, right? So as you mentioned, I can have justification for a belief that's false. Another way to think of it is in terms of a Gettier case. I might have a justified true belief that still falls short of knowledge and falls short of being warranted, because I'm in this sort of weird case where my belief is accidentally true. Right? So I've got, like Chisholm's sheep in the field. I look at what looks like a sheep, I've got no reason to doubt it, and I believe, oh, there's a sheep in the field. But what I'm looking at is actually not a sheep. It's, Wile E. Coyote in disguise. And behind a rock that I can't see at all, there's one sheep. It's justified, it's true, but it's not warranted because I'm lacking something. So yeah, I think that for warrant, however it spells out, you need something more than just justification. I would think you need what's sometimes referred to as basing. So I can have good reason to believe something, but not believe it for those good reasons, right? So you might tell me that, hey, it's raining where you're at. That's great reason to believe that it's raining where you're at. But say maybe I believe that, but not because of that, but maybe just because I have this irrational thought that it always rains on Saturdays. Right. So now I've got justification, but I'm not believing it for the right reasons. Right. So justification is, to my mind, it's having good evidence for what you believe. Another way to put it, it's having good epistemic reasons for what you believe. Warrant requires, at a minimum, having that good evidence, believing the right thing because of that good evidence, and satisfying a anti-Gettier condition, right? So it's a much stronger condition.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So let me zoom out just slightly, because we got a little bit down in the weeds, but that's okay. I'm really enjoying it. So I asked you what counts as evidence, and we said perception. So I'm looking, even though there's no like physical person in front of me right now.
Right. Sure.
I just have a computer in front of me. I'm still perceiving you. I guess indirectly, I'm perceiving you through a computer, but that's still evidence that you're there, that you're real.
Right. Yeah. Especially
it's not a proof. Like solipsism could be true, and I'm just imagining all this, but nevertheless, it indicates that you're there. It is an indicator that you're there.
Right.
And so that's perception. Testimony, if you told me that, you drove to your office at the University of Alabama, then that would be evidence that you are in fact there.
Right.
Even though you could just be at your house right now. Again, it's not a proof, but it's evidence.
Right.
And then memory, if you told me you ate cereal for breakfast, that's evidence that you had cereal for breakfast. Arguments, yeah, I'm glad you clarified the thing with arguments. I guess with arguments, what I was thinking of, to go back slightly into the weeds here, yeah, so you, more broadly, they indicate the way things are.
Right.
So when I reach some conclusion that tells me about the way things are, and as long as those premises are true, I'm thinking of a deductive argument here, but as long as those premises are true and they follow from some rule of logic, then now I have an excellent indicator that something is the way that the conclusion says it is.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's why arguments are that way. And I guess this is what I was going to say to just get down in the weeds for one more minute. If you think of evidence as propositions, then that conclusion is a proposition, and I now have really good reason for thinking that proposition is true. So now I've got this new piece of evidence.
Right.
I had these other propositions, and they gave me evidence for this proposition.
Right.
And this proposition can now serve as evidence.
Yes.
Right. But even if evidence isn't propositions, if it's just the mental state,
Right.
then reflection upon the argument could give me.
Yeah, good. So when we're talking about an argument, Jordan, we've got presumably you've got good reason to believe each of the premises, right? And so perhaps you justifiably believe the premises, right? So an evidentialist, especially, or not even just evidentialist, anyone who's going to take mental states to be evidence, whether they're an evidentialist or not, is going to allow that a subset of our beliefs count as evidence, right? And even people who take propositions are going to say, well, a certain subset of our beliefs are vehicles by which we get the propositions as evidence, right? And I say a subset because most are going to deny that just any belief counts as evidence, right? It's only going to be your justified beliefs, the ones that are reasonable or rational. So say I've got a justified belief in premise 1. Okay, so now premise 1 can be evidence for me. I've got a justified belief in premise 2. That's evidence, and so on. And then I also, especially if I'm, running through an argument, I can see how the premises, these justified beliefs I have, entail this other belief. Well, now I've got justification for accepting this other claim about the world. And so the person who's a mentalist about, evidence, who's going to say it's the mental state, is going to say, yeah, now it's what's my evidence for the conclusion is, the mental states of my justified beliefs concerning the premises, my awareness or so on that the premises support the conclusion. And then the conclusion is going to come to be evidence I have when I justifiably believe that conclusion.
I see.
And so we're going to end up in the same place, right? So the person who thinks propositions are evidence are going to say the conclusion, that proposition is part of your evidence now because you justifiably believe it. Whereas the person who says the mental state's is your evidence is going to say, well, no, your evidence just is that mental state. That justified belief is the evidence rather than the proposition. And it can be described propositionally.
Yeah. Okay. This has been really helpful.
Oh,
so
good.
Now I guess let's wrap up with the part here at the end about there is no evidence for God. So you said at the beginning, like those that are saying this, they're making one of two mistakes. Why don't you repeat that and then tie that in with why they're making a mistake when they say there is no evidence for God?
Great. Yeah. So I think that, the mistakes are either, the best I can understand it is, because I'm assuming sincerity that they really believe this. They're not just saying it, they're not just, I'm assuming they're not just meaning this for shorthand of, Jordan, you're giving bad arguments, right?
Right.
I'm assuming that they either mean something like we mentioned, that arguments just can't be evidence or whatever, or, evidence is only this sort of physical stuff, which they can't mean that. Because presumably if someone is an atheist rather than just an agnostic, I would think that they think there are good reasons to not believe that God exists, right? So if there isn't any evidence that God exists, if that were true, and there were no evidence that God doesn't exist, that should leave you with agnosticism, right? You have no reason one way or the other. So you shouldn't have a view, right? But presumably they have a view, right? So presumably they take something to be evidence. So I'm thinking that either they're not, my guess is
I'm hung up on a thing you said a second ago. You said, presumably there is good evidence to not believe in God.
If you're an atheist.
If you're an atheist.
You think there is at least good evidence to not, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But wouldn't that apply to an agnostic as well? Because I'm thinking of the distinction, there's a difference between not believing in God and believing that God does not exist.
Right, exactly.
So the agnostic could say there are good reasons to not believe in God, but there are also good reasons.
Sure.
You see what I mean? So
yeah.
But in the case of the atheist, it would be that presumably there are good reasons to believe that God does not exist.
Good. Yeah. So I should be more careful. So someone could be an agnostic in a few ways. One, they could be an agnostic in the sense of they think there's no evidence one way or the other. Right. So that's why I was saying, if the person posting this thinks there is no evidence that God exists, they still, if they're going to be an atheist, they have to think that there is evidence that God does not exist, or else they would think there's no evidence whatsoever, in which case they should be an agnostic. Of course, another way to be an agnostic is for someone to think, well, there's maybe some evidence that God exists, but there's also evidence that God doesn't exist, and it's kind of balanced. So the atheist, I think, to be rational in holding atheism rather than some other position, has to, to actually be rational, they have to actually have the evidence. But to think that they're rational in doing this, they have to think that there is evidence that, at least on balance, supports believing that God doesn't exist. So that leads me to think they have to, they're not working with just this sort of view of evidence as just physical objects. What I think is probably happening is they're applying a standard of evidence when it comes to the existence of God that is just unrealistically demanding. And what I mean by that is they're applying I would think, most likely, this is what I encounter with students and so on, when they make these sorts of claims, is I think they're applying a standard that they don't hold any of their other beliefs to. Right. So they're having this sort of standard, whatever it might be. Often, if you ask them and you start pushing on it, you realize that they're not as clear about the standard. And that may not be in all cases, but in a lot of cases, they're holding a standard of something like the following. There's no empirical evidence, they'll say, that God exists, right? I can't go outside and look, or whatever it was, the Russian cosmonaut, back in the 60s. If I go into space, I look around, I don't see God. So therefore, there's no evidence that God exists. But that's a really, really demanding standard, right? And it's a strange one, right? So it's this one that says, well, we have to have this empirical stuff. And often they may even mean, I have to have some evidence that I can experience and can show to you, and you can have the same one, right? Because someone might have a religious experience. If someone experiences the Holy Spirit and you tell this atheist, they're going to say, that's not evidence, right? Presumably they're going to say that's not
right.
Because lots of people have had this experience, right? So if you say there's no evidence that God exists, you have to deny that those are evidence. Now, if that's the case, you don't want to end up saying experience isn't evidence, right? Because you're really like that from under.
You destroyed perception.
Everything else, right?
A lot of your beliefs are based on perception, and
exactly. So they have to be thinking, no, the only thing that can be evidence are things that can be directly shared with someone else, so you can have the same sort of thing. But that's ridiculously demanding. So, for instance, that same person, if they're in pain, they know this by their having an experience. Say they have a headache. Okay, how are you going to share that with me? You cannot share your pain. You can tell me you're in pain, but someone can tell me they've, had an experience of the Holy Spirit in their life. That's the same, right? There's no way for me as a third-party observer to tell, right? So if they're not going to count one, why count? Why count the other? So they have to be having this really strong sort of view of evidence. And it's strange to me. I'll just mention, it's really strange to me to not want to count good arguments, as you mentioned. Typically, at least in philosophy, the best sort of evidence you could have for something is, say, take mathematics or logic, right? A sound deductive proof of something. That's the gold standard for evidence. It cannot be wrong, right? So why would you not count a good argument? So that's really strange to me. So I think that something like that's going on, because if they're denying your arguments, now they might just mean, well, arguments are good evidence, but you're giving bad arguments.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if that's the case, they should tell you where the argument goes wrong or where they think it goes wrong. But if you really think, well, arguments aren't good evidence, then it becomes less and less clear of, well, what is good evidence? Because if you're going to tell me, well, only this empirical stuff is evidence, you get into other sorts of problems, right? So if I can't run an empirical test on it, they're going to say you don't have evidence. That's really weird. So imagine, I mentioned the pain. Sometimes we can run a test, right? If you have a cut or something, but if it's something like a headache, right? Or think of an emotional state, right? So I feel anxious. What's your empirical test? You might say, well, we'll see how you behave. That doesn't tell you, directly that I have, an anxious feeling. That gives you maybe some evidence because you know what that looks like. But all of those same things can be said for, the existence of God. You can say, well, look, here's some behavioral tests. Look how this person was before they said they became a Christian. Look how they are now. Well, their behavior, certain things have changed. That gives us evidence that something has happened, something real. But any of those sorts of things, if they're going to deny that, you run into lots of problems if you have this really, really strict view of evidence. So take memory, right? Do they want to count their own memories of what you said as evidence that you actually said it, right? Or if you don't, you're done, right? I mean, if you can't rely on memory, you don't have any evidence for anything because you have to remember long enough to process. So anyway, I guess that's kind of rambling, but there's just lots of, it's tough to know exactly what the complaint is being made. I'm trying to think of it in a way that can be somewhat plausible, but it's hard to do. I find it a really bad complaint.
So the most charitable interpretation would probably be the most charitable interpretation of that slogan, "There is no evidence for God," would probably be something like, there are only bad arguments, or I guess there's lots of different things that could count as evidence, but if we're thinking about arguments, it would be, there are only bad arguments for God. That's what it really would mean.
Right. Yeah, that would be the most charitable, to say, there's only bad arguments. Now, if they really want to make a case, they've got to, it's got to be they're only bad arguments. Religious experiences are completely, they're untrustworthy.
But not experiences in general, right? So if they said experiences in general, then that's the problem. But religious experiences are unreliable.
Yeah, they have to think that's unreliable. Arguments for God's existence are all bad. Testimonial evidence for God is, it's defeated because the experiences are unreliable and, the arguments are bad. So to say there's no evidence, if the most charitable one is they've got to actually do a lot of work, right? They've got to cut through a lot of these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And it becomes really tough to do a lot of that, I think. Well, one, because they're wrong, but it's also tough to do that because that's a lot of things to go through. And it's, as we mentioned, Jordan, they've got to do it in such a way that they kind of weave a path where you don't just land up in just full-blown skepticism about everything, right? Because mm-hmm. you start saying, well, these experiences we can't trust. Why not? Why can you trust these others? So these arguments are all bad. Why? Why are they bad? You can't trust this sort of testimony. Okay, but you don't want to say you can't trust all testimony, or else again, you're kind of, full-blown skepticism. So I think the most charitable thing is it's a way of saying either all of these are bad sources, or I think it might also simply be a way of saying there's no empirical evidence that God exists.
Mm-hmm. Hey, you didn't do this, but it might help. Mm-hmm. You gave some examples, but typically at least when philosophers, and because you'll see that philosophers will say, we have evidence here, but it's not empirical evidence. What do we mean when we say empirical evidence?
Yeah, so typically empirical evidence would be, in kind of the more general term, evidence we get directly from our senses, right? But we also will use this in a more strict term, where I think they might be making the objection, like empirical evidence being something that we can all observe, right? That's observable to other people, right? So we can observe it, and then I can observe it, and you can observe the same thing. Mm-hmm. They'll often think that sort of standard. It's tricky too, I guess, just to pile on a bit. If you have that sort of standard, and you think, well, there's no evidence, there's this sort of evidence. Lots of things we believe on the basis of testimony, right? Or on the basis of an argument, right? So we read something and we either take it directly on testimony, or we think they've given us good enough reasons to accept it. Very few things do we actually get out and look at the empirical evidence for, right? So think of any sort of scientific theory. We don't go and test them unless you're, a practicing scientist. And even then, you don't test the established theories. You're testing new things. Why do you believe it? Because someone told you, right? Because that's what people tell you. That's that, and it fits, that makes sense and so on. But there's a reliance on testimony that everyone's doing. And if we just want to say empirical evidence, here's also I got to throw this in because it just fits so well. Although if you don't like arguments, it may not work so well. If you think that the only thing that it's reasonable to believe are things that you have empirical evidence for, right? That seems to be one way they might be thinking this. Well, we'll put it in terms of an argument, but they won't like the argument. But you might think, if this is to work as an objection, it needs to be something like, it's only reasonable to believe things for which you have empirical evidence. You don't have empirical evidence that God exists, therefore it's not reasonable to believe God exists. Okay. How in the world are you justified in believing that first premise? The first premise says the only things you should believe are things you have empirical evidence for. What's the empirical evidence for that? There's not. It's a general principle about what's rational and what's not. There is none. So if the principle is true, you have no good reason to believe it, right? It's kind of that was one of the things I mentioned early on about either they have a confused, they're kind of applying a too high of a standard, or maybe they're just confused about evidence, right? So this sort of self-defeating view of what counts as evidence, I think, would be the confused sort.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I've said a lot and kind of rambled a bit, but
no, that was good. I'll back up slightly. I guess I hadn't quite thought of it this way before. So this may sound shocking to you. I don't know how familiar you are with like online YouTube type slogans in among atheists.
Not very familiar at all.
Yeah. So there's this kind of move that gets made where atheism is just a lack of belief in God. It's not a belief that God does not exist. It's just a lack of belief. And you could say lots of things about, well, that lumps agnostics. It
Right.
conflates the two, but just set that stuff aside. That's what is frequently said. But you made a connection that I hadn't thought of previously, and that is many of those same people make this claim that there is no evidence for God.
Mm-hmm.
So now here's how I see those two things saying, well, atheism is a lack of belief in God, but then claiming there is no evidence for God. Looking at those two, there's an interesting tension maybe between the two, and that is this. So usually I don't want to say this is why, but maybe this is a benefit of claiming that atheism is a lack of belief. If you say atheism is a lack of belief, typically they say, so I bear no burden of proof now. If I had a positive belief, then I would bear some burden of proof. But I just merely lack it. So you, the theist, need to give your reasons. But I'm not responsible to have to give any reasons for my lack of belief. However, once you make the claim, now this is a positive claim at this point.
Mm-hmm.
If you say there is no evidence for God, now you do have something you have to defend. You do bear a burden of proof. And that is, once the theist gives an argument or something, if you say, but there is no evidence for God, you have to say, that's basically saying, well, that's a bad argument. So now you have to show me why it's a bad argument. If I say, I've had a religious experience, and you say, well, there is no evidence for God, it's not enough just to say that. You have to say, here's why your religious experience is unreliable. And you have to give an argument then.
Right.
So it seems like going the lack of belief route may remove you from a burden of proof. But if you add to it this claim, there is no evidence for God, you have something, you do bear a burden of proof now.
I think that's exactly right, Jordan. There's no free lunch if we're going to engage in rational discourse, right? Yeah. So you get out of that one, I'm with you, I guess, as with most philosophers, I don't like the lack of precision in terms. I don't like lumping, I mean, in one sense, like if we think of Pascal, right? And there is a sense you either believe or you don't, right? In one sense, but when we're talking about arguments and burdens of proof and so on, but there are three positions, right? There's, Christians or theists more broadly, they're agnostics and they're atheists. But yeah, if you want to lump them in, you're right. I think they do get rid of that positive burden of, okay, now you don't have to give an actual argument against God's existence. But if you're really going to hold that it's rational for you to not believe, then you need defeaters, right? You need some reason against all of the purported evidence that you're given. So when you post arguments, right, and like I said, I've watched some of the videos and listened to the podcast, what I think of really good arguments, right? Then if you want to hold to this position rationally, I mean, you can do all sorts of things if you give up being rational, but presumably everyone in the discussion wants to be rational about this. If you want to do that and you want to say, well, I just don't believe God exists. Well, if I give you an argument, or you give someone an argument that God exists, and you want to, continue to be rational in your agnosticism, that you want to call atheism, you need to have a reason to doubt that argument, right? You need to have something. And I'm with you. It better not be arguments in general are not good evidence.
Mm-hmm.
That's the wrong way to go, right? You're going to have to say either the premises don't support the conclusion or a premise is false. And the similar sort of thing, like you mentioned with religious experience, and you say, well, lots and lots of people, so it's not just someone, lots of people have had religious experiences. You're going to have to say, here's why it's not reasonable to trust that they've either had the experience or that it's the experience of what they think or so on. Now, the trick too, that I think a lot of people do, at least when I've had discussions with like students, I mentioned that I try to avoid online forums in that sense of discussions. Not that there's anything wrong with them. I think a lot of people, it's great that they do it. For me, I think I'm better actually talking with someone.
Right.
But often it's because they're already presupposing metaphysical naturalism, right? You're presupposing that the only thing that exists are physical things in the universe. And then you say, well, given that, of course, there must be an explanation for this person's religious experience that doesn't presuppose God. You can do that, but that's not your position if you don't have a view on this, right? So if you're really neutral, you shouldn't come to it, well, I'm a metaphysical naturalist, and then, I'm neutral. Well, no, you're automatically not neutral. That's presupposing God doesn't exist. If you come to it neutrally, what you have to do is then weigh the explanations of saying, okay, if I don't presuppose God doesn't exist, I'm just neutral on that. Someone has this experience. What explains this? Maybe I can give a naturalistic explanation, but I can also give an explanation that appeals to God. And then we start comparing, which explanation is better. And that's what they have to do. And that's the real work, is say, now I've got to do this, and I've got to make the case that the naturalistic explanation is better, right? And the same thing with like testimony, right? I've got to give some sort of argument for thinking I can't trust, the testimony, right? So, especially in philosophy, I mean, we're not big on, consensus or whatever, but there is something to be said if you look at, if a lot of people tell you the same thing and they seem to be somewhat independent, there's issues there. That's at least some evidence for it, right? For that thing being true, right? So 5 different witnesses tell me they saw an accident and it was the blue car's fault. That's evidence to think it was the blue car's fault. Now, if I can come through and find out that there's some sort of connection, right? They're all friends of the red car, and and they're all whatever they stand to gain, then maybe I've got to defeat her. But just once enough people say this, that's some evidence that I've got to overcome. And if you look at the fact that the vast majority of people, in human history have believed in God, right? And there's several billion Christians now, that may not be decisive evidence, but it's some evidence, right? And it's still something that if you're going to say there's no evidence, you need to come up with a good account for why all of these people are wrong about this, right? So I think you're right. I think you get away from a burden of, now I need to give an atheistic argument, right? I need to give an argument that shows God doesn't exist. But you don't get out of the burden of, you need to address, right? If you're really going to make these sorts of claims and you're going to do it in good faith,
you have to provide defeaters of the theistic arguments.
Exactly.
There's a difference between providing a positive argument for atheism and providing defeaters for theistic arguments. You may get out of the one, but if you make that there is no evidence claim, you're stuck with, I have to provide defeaters now for these theistic arguments.
Right. And really your claim, if you're being careful, which it sounds better to say there's no evidence, right? But if they're really being careful, what they want to say is there's no undefeated evidence. There's evidence, but they want to say, but ultimately we have defeaters, and so that evidence loses all of the power it would have had, right? that's not as catchy and, as there's no evidence. But yeah, I think you're right. You still have this burden of you've got to produce defeaters for all these things. It's not enough to just, you post arguments for someone just say, well, there's no evidence. Okay, where's the problem with the argument?
Right.
Like I often tell my students, here's an argument for a conclusion you don't like. Here are your options if you really want to engage with this. Suck it up and accept the conclusion, right? Or find a problem with this argument. I think that's right.
All right. Well, I think I'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Kevin, for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is great.
Go and check out my interview with Chris Tucker, where he argues that seemings are get to count as evidence for God. And go and check out my videos where I give Richard Swinburne's arguments for theism. That way you can hear how seemings can count for evidence for God, and also how these arguments can count for evidence for God. All right. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.